Here's a couple of tips for people who are learning Laravel, or to be fair, or for people who are learning any backend framework. It could be Symfony, it could be anything else. Even if you're learning something like Coding Night or Zend in 2023, this tip's still valid. So it doesn't matter what the framework you learn. One thing you really gotta keep in mind is what's the framework built on. Right, this goes for everything, right? So even if you're learning a JavaScript framework, React, you gotta ask yourself. Well, you should know this already, but what's the framework built on? It's built on JavaScript. So the obvious question to ask is, do you know enough JavaScript? First off, right? But that's how you start. You start with A, B, C. You don't start with X and then jump to Z. That's totally wrong. So start with uh, asking that question: what's the framework built on? If it's so, for example, Laravel, which is built on PHP. For anyone who's starting off, gotta know that it's built on PHP, and they have to know PHP. So that's tip number one. You, no matter the framework, you gotta know what's the foundation built on, and you gotta learn that thing, whatever that is. So if it's PHP, go learn PHP, go learn some basics of PHP, build some projects. So when you start working with Laravel, you can understand things, you can kind of see what's going behind the scene. You don't need to know everything. Obviously, you never need to know everything. You just need to know enough to get by, enough. So when you get stuck, you can come up with a solution or figure out the problem. So for Laravel, learn PHP, get a couple years of experience with PHP. Now there's the other side um, of uh, of the fence. The people are gonna tell you that you don't need to know PHP or something along the lines to learn Laravel. That's totally wrong. You do have to know the foundation. So a lot of times people who are giving advices like this, they also got courses to sell you. Just go learn Laravel. Laravel is a beginner's framework, stuff like this. Well, it's not a beginner framework. Something that completely hides the complexity behind the scene can be seen as a beginner framework because it's hiding the complexity, and for you as a beginner it's easy to use initially. But because you can't see what's happening behind the scene, you can't customize it because you don't understand the language itself, it's going to become very difficult down the line, even for small projects. So you have to know PHP. So people who's telling you that yes, it's a beginner framework, maybe it is, I don't know. I totally disagree though, in a sense. It's not a beginner framework. um, so learn PHP. If you're learning React, something like, learn JavaScript, and get good at that. To be fair, it's gonna help you. Obviously you can take a shortcut, you can just not learn PHP or learn it for a month and then pick Laravel and see how far it can take you. Maybe it'll take you far, but once you're in the job, you gotta do the job. You gotta know what you're doing. So tip number one, if you're learning Laravel, you make sure you know PHP. Make sure you have built some projects in PHP so you can see the importance of Laravel, the features it provides, the additional help it gives you. So you can actually see it, and you can make sense of things, not just here's the authentication, run this command and you got authentication there. Well, you will get the authentication, but what if you need to customize? To customize, you need to know PHP, and if you don't know PHP, then what will you? You'll Google it and you will copy paste snippets, and you will have a huge problem, because whatever you're copying, whether it's from ChatGPT or from Google or no, wherever, you're just making a mess there. Um, and if you're working with a pre-existing system, then you're making it even worse because you don't understand anything. So imagine working with Laravel system and you haven't worked with PHP, only because someone told you that you don't need to be advanced PHP developer to know Laravel or to work with Laravel projects. Now you suddenly messing up with Laravel, you're messing up with the queries. There's so much happening behind the scene. You have no idea. So whichever language you pick, just make sure, whichever framework you pick, make sure you understand the foundation. Right, that's tip number one. And the only reason it's important is because I see a lot of people thinking that Laravel is a beginner's framework. Well, the Laravel itself exists so you can build complicated projects easily, right? If it's a small project, why don't you just build it in PHP anyway? So Laravel exists to solve a problem, right? To solve a problem that advanced developers are facing, right? So it's not a beginner's framework. Keep that in mind. Something like Coding Igniter is, because it doesn't hide so many things behind the scene. It lets you see what's happening. With Laravel, it hides a lot of things and it does a lot of magic. That's what they call it. So when you start off, you start seeing, oh, I can do this, I can do that. But when it comes to customizing or making changes, you're stuck because the documentation is well, as we know, a lot of the times documentations are marketing driven, targeted towards beginners. So when the beginners look, oh, this is so easy, that's so easy, they'll just jump on the dock and start using the framework because they think it's easy because the documentation is selling the framework as beginners. So keep that it's not a beginner framework. Make sure you know the foundation. Make sure you know the language behind it at least a little bit, at least a couple of years. Um, so that's point number one. Now, point number two is uh, database queries. With Laravel, you can use Eloquent, you can use Query Builder, or you can write your raw queries as well, if needed. A lot of the times, beginners are gonna start using Eloquent. What I strongly recommend is start off with Query Builder. Query Builder is closer to SQL than it is to Eloquent. Then SQL is to Eloquent. So if you just jump in and start using Eloquent straight away, you're gonna have a lot of problems. First, you're gonna set up the relationship, and you don't even know how. Well, you might know how to set up the relationship, but then if you need to tweak something, or if your database does not align with what relationship tells you, with how relationship suggests your database to be. So, for example, your database needs to be put together in a certain way so the relationships can work. But if it's not put together in that way, and you will not put it in that way because you're a beginner, your relationships are not gonna work. That magic is not gonna happen, and it's gonna throw all sorts of error. And then you'll try to figure out what is this happening, why is it? Well, in the end of the day, you just didn't put uh, the database properly, right? But if you're using Query Builder, like I said, use Query Builder initially. If you're using Query Builder, then you will know a lot of things straight away. This is how it's going to be. Well, because it's very much close to how general SQL work. Well, I shouldn't need to mention that you need to know SQL now. I mean, if you don't know SQL, then you shouldn't even be touching Laravel anyway. So initially, use Query Builder for whatever you can. You can set up a basic relationship after a while, once you understand the ecosystem, once you understand how the queries work. But until then, you're free to use Query Builder. Now, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be like, why are you using Query Builder for this? Why are you? Well, it's going to make your life so much easy. Well, you're using it so you can understand the system, right? And so you can actually build things. Once you start getting used to Query Builder, then you can learn about relationships as well. So ORM, object relational model, is not a basic thing. It's an advanced concept. So just because Laravel makes it so easy to use doesn't mean it's easy. Start off with Query Builder. Make sure you know SQL, obviously. Then you can transition to using Eloquent. Eloquent is going to make your life much easier. Obviously, you're going to have some problems sometimes because you don't know what's happening behind the scene. You need to speed up the queries, and then Eloquent is just generating so much rubbish behind the scene. You're going to have problems like this. But start off with Query Builder, make sure you know SQL, and then transition to using Eloquent. It's going to make your life easier. That's tip number 2. Now, tip number 3. Now, again, this is opposed to what most people are going to tell you. Stick to the standards. Do what Laravel tells you to. Now, this goes for any framework. Each framework is going to have specific things where it almost forces you to, well, it forces you to do things in certain way through the documentation, right? But if you ask the same question to a person who has experience, they'll tell you do it this way. Don't do how the documentation suggests, but do it this way because it's easy. The documentation is making the whole thing much harder. So regardless, this is tip number 3. Regardless of what anyone tells you, do things in the easiest way. Forget about tradition, forget about the standard, forget about clean code. This is what you're building. You're building an application. What do you need to build an application? You need a route. You need a controller. Now people are going to say, hey, don't put code in the controller. Your response should be, I will, because I need to get this application off the ground. But if you do not put your code in the control, you move it to a service class, then obviously you'll start moving all the code to different service class, and then suddenly your application is so complicated you can't even deliver the project on time. You can't finish it on time, and you're like, ah, I'm stuck. This is the problem. That's the problem. Dependency. Da da da. You're gonna have so many problems suddenly. So forget about what people say. Sometimes forget about what documentation says. Well, use your own brain. Use your mind. Here's the project. Here's the requirements, and this is what I need to deliver. Now, do whatever you need to do to deliver it, but do not just blindly follow the documentation. Do not follow people's advice that you have to use XYZ driver to do XYZ. You have to use an Excel driver to manipulate the Excel file. None of that. Just keep in mind, here's my aim. Just do whatever you need to do to deliver that. That's very important. So this will keep you from going in wrong directions, trying to learn this, trying to, suddenly I need to learn Vue, suddenly I need to learn that, I need to download this package because it makes my life easy. But when you download the package, it actually makes your life hard and adds more 1 or 2 weeks of development time because you need to learn the package. And then when you're stuck, then you're just stuck because you're a beginner. And when you go search about that package, you're not going to find much support. So keep your aim in mind. It's very important. So like I said, 3 tips. You make sure you know the foundation of the framework. When you're starting off, you make sure you start off with the query builder and not eloquent. And just last tips, forget about best practices. Use the framework to do what you need to do. So keep those things in mind. You'll be good.